It's fine. Hi everyone. Thanks to all of you for coming. I'm very excited to give you a presentation about my work, my background, and the start of this curatorial residency here in Istanbul. So I'm Nikolaos Akritidis. I'm a curator with a background in urban studies and human geography. I began organizing exhibitions in 2017, and since then have also worked for a range of organizations in the cultural field. And at present, for the past year, I've been working freelance based in Belgium, in Brussels. I work with a foundation there, with the Fondation d'Entreprise Hermès, which has a space in Brussels. And I work with their cultural mediation team. So we do public programs, tours, audience development, and I also work on my own projects on the side. I'm Greek, and I grew up between Brussels and Greece. And I also spent several years living in the UK for studies and work before returning to Brussels 3 years ago. And this is my first time in Istanbul. I arrived last week, so I'm very happy to be with all of you. For this presentation, I'll begin maybe by introducing some ideas about this context between fine art and geography, and how I see maybe my practice acting like a bridge between these two disciplines, trying to bring some geographical research methodologies to fine art projects, and also bringing fine art thinking to geographical research. I titled this talk Adventive Journeys and Ruderal Methodologies, just to introduce some of these ideas that I think maybe give a good context to begin this talk. So I'm starting with just this image that I took this morning, actually, right next to where I'm staying in Pürtülaş Sokak, of this plant here on the edge of some stairs, which we might call spontaneous vegetation, a little piece of urban life sprawling from the pavement. And I'd like to start from here and ask a question of something that we maybe don't ask ourselves very regularly, but where did that plant come from? How did it end up there and started growing and surviving in this little corner? And incidentally also, what does this encounter between myself or any of you and these plants that we find which survive in the urban context, what can that teach us about wider flows of the movement of species, humans, and how they congregate in cities, which are in a way theaters of coexistence. So maybe we can go to the next slide. This is a diagram which is quite well known in the urban ecology field, it dates 1977, it's quite old, and it shows the metabolism of Brussels. It was designed by Paul Duvigneau, who was one of the early pioneers of the field of urban ecology. And thinking about cities as separate ecosystems with their own dynamics is actually quite a recent field of study. It only really emerged and solidified as a field of research in the early 1970s. And Brussels was one of the hotspots actually for that, with Paul Duvigneau, who here, as you can see, made a diagram showing how a city has its own metabolism that takes in people, resources, energy, and then transforms it into things like waste, new products, and also ideas which come out of urban settings. I think this is relevant, and it's a good diagram to begin thinking about how cities, of course, have their own specific cultural backgrounds, approaches to architecture, to conservation of heritage, but they're also centers for trade flows, movements of people, things like ports. For example, in Istanbul, port cities have these interfaces to the world that become centers of gravity for people, species, and other presences. So maybe we can go to the next slide. And the first slide I showed you with this plant is what we might call a ruderal plant, plants which grow on the pavement, on stones, or in other places where you might not expect life to survive without any help. And I think this term is quite key for me, rudorality, which is a term that is used as a scale in botany to describe the capacity that a plant has to survive in hostile contexts where there are no other plants, there's maybe not even any dirt or soil. And this could be because in their native habitat they developed life traits that allowed them to grow and survive on mountains, for example, or on granite surfaces, and in a way pre-adapt them to survive in cities. But rudorality, the word itself, comes from the Latin rudus, which means rubble. So it means that which emerges from the rubble. And I think it's been a very useful term for me to think of methodologies for art making and also for developing curatorial projects. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Durham. Yeah. So I mentioned the cities as a center for coexistence, for trade flows, and also, of course, for the impact that humanity has had on Earth and on a global scale. It's broadly agreed upon that we live in an era where humanity is the leading geophysical force on Earth. Some people call it the Anthropocene, some people call it the Capitalocene, the Cthulhucene, etc. But there is maybe if we can go just to the previous slide. No. This one, yes. There is a debate about when exactly that period began. Some people give the beginning of the industrial age as a start date. Others talk about the nuclear age. But I would agree maybe with two scientists, Mark Maslin and Simon Lewis, who actually look at 1610 and the geological event of the Orbis spike as the start date for the Anthropocene. You can see here on this graph the red line shows the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, and here there is a dip. The CO2 falls before it starts going up, and this date coincides with the first European colonial expeditions and their impact in the Americas. So if we go actually to the slide with the graph, yes. What happened during those early intercontinental exchanges, I mean, before that, ecosystems had reached a relative state of balance. And during the 1500s, there was this accelerated intercontinental movement of people, but also species, some of which were introduced on purpose. They were brought from one continent to the other for a specific reason. And others just sort of hitched a ride. So this really brought a deregulation of ecosystems globally and set a process in motion that is still unfolding today of displacement of species, of genetic movement across the globe. You can see this graph shows what we call the Columbian exchange of species that were brought to the Americas and from the Americas to Eurasia and Africa. And these, of course, included diseases like smallpox, measles, and typhus. And so the Orbis spike, the drop of CO2, actually refers to the impact that these diseases had on indigenous populations and on the use of land, because they led to a genocide of indigenous populations in the Americas. And all of their land that was used for agriculture or for settlements became reforested. And that happened on a massive enough scale that it created a dip in the CO2 levels of the atmosphere because the trees absorbed CO2. So Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin prefer to use that date as the start of this period where humanity really has had this impact. Maybe we can go to the next slide. So within this context of intercontinental movement of people and species, I wanted to talk to you a bit about ballasts. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this term. Ballast is a term that is used to describe the weight that is placed on ships, on cargo, which is destined for international trades. So for example, when a ship arrives at its destination and unloads the cargo and begins its trip back, the weight is much lighter, so the ship is unstable, and it must be loaded with certain objects or weights to give it stability for the trip. Now, historically, for example, during those early trips between Europe and the Americas, ballasts were approximately anything you could imagine. Here's, for example, a stone that was used as ballast and was found after the first expedition that the British did on the Roanoke Islands. But they also used dirt, sandbags, trees, and these were loaded up on one port, and then when you arrived at destination port, they were just tossed aside. So they also were, in a way, without it being its primary purpose, biological agents that carried all sorts of species, seeds, that then traveled in between continents with them. Maybe next slide. And today this is still relevant. Of course, we don't use stones and trees for ballast anymore, but modern cargo ships have the same system with ballast tanks. So when they arrive at the port of destination, they unload the cargo, they intake ballast water from the port, then they arrive back at the other port and they offload this water in their destination. And that's how you end up with, for example, a species like this, which is Nemiopsis lady. It's a sort of comb jelly that's native to the western Atlantic waters, coastal waters close to the North American shores. This species has now been established in the Bosphorus, and it's considered a threat to local biodiversity, as well as also other, species that hitch a ride, intentionally or not, between continents. This, for example, another picture from this morning at the corner of Pürtülaş Sokak is really beautiful, the way this tree comes out of the building. Who knows how it ended up there, but this is a species called Ailanthus altissima, also known as tree of heaven, which is originally native to East Asia, parts of China and Taiwan more specifically, and was brought to Europe in the 18th century during the period of chinoiserie, because people thought that it looks beautiful and it's a nice ornamental plant for gardens. Turns out it's quite difficult to contain its spread, and it also smells strange when it flowers for a certain part of the year. So then when they started trying to get rid of it after introducing it, they realized they couldn't do it. And now you find these trees growing all over cities like Istanbul, also Athens and beyond, without any help. And I think, maybe we can go to the next slide. This movement of species across the continent can also inform our thinking about thresholds, borders, and the way we view movement of people also. So I would make also a comparison between the movement of these species and the movement of people. As you can see, in all of these cases, they are deeply entwined, and they congregate in cities where both people and these other species live together and coexist, sharing space. I wanted to share a couple examples of artworks and to see sort of how artists maybe interact with these themes and how this bridge between fine art and geography can materialize itself. This is a project by Maria Teresa Alves, who is a Brazilian artist born in 1961. She's been living and working in Berlin for a long time and has developed a body of work notably around this movement of seeds and plants around the world. This is a project she did called A Floating Ballast Seed Garden in the 2010s in Bristol, in collaboration with the Bristol City Council, local universities, the Botanical Garden, and Arnolfini Gallery. So they created this floating garden on a platform that grew only plants which arrived in Bristol through ballasts. So of course, Bristol was an important colonial port, and during that time a lot of species arrived and integrated the local ecosystem that then Maria Teresa Alves retrieved and grew specifically on this platform to study them with scientists, artists, students, etc. Maybe we can go to the next slide. You can see here that it was a long-term project. It lasted about 4 years. So it also worked with the cycles of each plant over the years and contributed to building conversations and awareness also around these issues and the movement of plants and people around the globe. Here, the other term that I mentioned, so we talked a bit about rurality, but I also used the word adventive in the title of this presentation. And adventive comes back to the use of language. So instead of using terms such as invasive plants and species or non-native plants and species, we could, for example, make a conscious use of language and use adventive, which was used by the predecessors of today's urban ecologists just to describe plants or species that come from elsewhere. I think this use of terminology is important because, of course, language such as invasive species, alien species, invasive people also contributes to building an imaginary of defensive walls of a city or a country against which others who are coming must be repelled. We must protect these borders, these thresholds, and this understanding has very real repercussions on political decision making, as well as the way that we relate to each other and to the other living beings around us. Here's another project I wanted to include by Maria Teresa Alves called Wake for Berlin. She's been based in Berlin for many years, and in the 2000s the city went through this frenzy of development, building a lot of new constructions, and so a lot of concrete and asphalt surfaces were dug up, and she took the opportunity to extract with these tubes that you can extract a pillar of soil from several locations across the city, extracting the seeds from them and attempting to grow them to create an atlas, a sort of historiography of place through the cities that can be found, through the seeds that can be found in soil in a specific site. Concerning the work of Maria Teresa Alves, I mean, a lot has been written about this journeying of seeds in relation to her work, but this is quite central for me in the context of what I've been talking about in this talk, that this movement of seeds and species around the world can maybe help us think of questions around nativity and belonging, nationhood, which are also rooted in the dynamic adaptability of the migrant subjects. Then for another example, this is a work by Herman de Vries, who is a Dutch artist who was born in 1931 and has also coincidentally been living in Germany for many years. This is a brilliant series of works called Sanctuaries, and it is a very good example of what happens if maybe instead of going to destroy, to uproot all of these plants that start growing by themselves, if we were to simply allow them to exist and allow ecological succession to take hold, they would eventually become a forest. So you can see here, this is just a road junction with grass, and the Sanctuary series consists of creating a wall or a sort of barrier and claiming that whatever is inside is sacred and humans can no longer or should no longer interact with it. This one was installed in 1993, and you can see, if we go to the next slide, that a few years later, without any human involvement, a community of species starts growing by itself without any support. And then again, the next slide, it can grow really a lot. This is a picture in, we don't know, but in the mid-2010s probably. So the rest of the ground keeps being mowed, again with this logic of control, also domination, that we impose on other living beings around us, including in the cities where we share space with them. But if we were to simply allow them to exist, wondrous things could happen. And unfortunately, the city council, in this case, when it grew a bit out of control, decided to raise everything to the ground without warning the artist at all. But now the process is starting again. Of course, 25 years of growth were lost. But it's a good example of how city councils, in particular, try to control every piece of land, and, for example, where spontaneous vegetation could grow. So these were some examples of artworks. Maybe we can continue. That also show how, in the same way that we have this agency around the world, how humanity is the leading geophysical force on the planet, well, other species have that agency as well. And maybe one of the reasons why these species that are termed so-called invasive or non-native, that threaten local ecosystems, they scare us because they are, in a way, a form of memento mori. They remind us that we're also part of a biological contract, and that some relations with other species will not be beneficial to us. I would also like to ask the question of whether we try to control these species and we try to limit their spread in a specific site, is this maybe futile to a certain extent? Can you really stop a small jellyfish or a worm or a tree from expanding its reach across an environment? Or would it even bring a purported previous state of balance that might have existed before that? I'm not sure, but these are questions I'm also asking in my work. So now I'll mention a few curatorial projects I've done in the past year. I'll see how we're doing with time. I'll kind of go over them quite fast, but of course, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to interrupt me, or we can talk about them later also. And we can go from these ideas that I presented to how they manifest themselves in research projects I've led or exhibitions that I've presented. The first one is a sort of public program I contributed to a couple of weeks ago in Brussels, which was led by Public Park, which is a curatorial initiative that started in Belgium in 2021. It's 4 curators that launched it: Anna Laganovska, Adrienne van der Werf, Jeff de Klerk, and Koi Person. Brilliant colleagues who began by doing an edition in 2021 in Ghent, in a park, and then it followed on with this dynamic of creating exhibitions meant for public green spaces that reflect on their natural and cultural heritage. They did an edition in 2023 in Antwerp, and this year they did it in Brussels. So they invited me to write a text for their walking guide, their publication, reflecting specifically on the history of the Brussels Botanical Garden, this institution which was initially placed at the edge of the city in the 19th century, and then as the city grew, was moved outside of the city. But the park still exists, and the venue has now become a cultural venue. So we did also a tour. They invited me to take some of these reflections that I developed in the text and give a tour of the green space to talk a little bit about its history, its current condition, and the pressures that it's feeling in the neighborhood where it's located. And then we also weaved in, there were some artist performances that day, so I took the group from my sort of tour to a performance by Elise El-Yousfi and then by Roy Koenke, who were two artists participating in their show. You can see here, for example, just a couple of images. This is a view of the Brussels Botanical Garden sometime in the late 19th century. So at the time it was at the edge of the city. You can see that there was this landscaped park, the botanical garden and the greenhouses there. And it was a sort of lieu de plaisance. People would go there to spend a day, see some exotic plants, and to discover this collection of botanical specimens which evolved hand in hand with the process of taxonomy and the European colonial settler sphere. So these botanical institutions were very much also about control, about categorizing plants and being able to study them, acclimatize them in Europe. You can see here, this was somewhat of a linear park at the time in Brussels. If we go to the next slide, in the 1930s, so about 100 years after the botanical garden was established, the city grew, of course, and there were concerns about the realities of city life, about urban pollution, which might harm the collection. And eventually there was a plan to create a tunnel under the botanical garden which would connect the North Station and the South Station, which sealed its fate. The botanical institution moved. And now the green space still exists, but under it is a tunnel where 1,200 trains pass every day. And the neighborhood around it is the most densely populated in Belgium. So the commune of Saint-Josse-ten-Noode has about 23,000 people per square kilometers living there. It's very dense quarters, and this green space has now become a very essential means of going outdoors, of having access to mental and physical well-being for a population that really needs it, which of course would have been unthinkable for the early decades of the institution. You can see here what used to be this linear park is now a boulevard full of cars. The park has become sort of sandwiched between infrastructural projects, major arteries of the city, and yet is still negotiating its daily uses with the people who use it. I also wanted to mention this project that we did at the start of September in Athens, which was I contributed to this program, which was an independent study and research trip called Terrestrial Tales. It was initiated 2 years ago by Mina Gürsel Tabanyoglu, who is an architect, and 2 years ago she did the first edition in Şirince at Arke, which is next to the mathematics village. And the idea is to gather a group of practitioners, which is interdisciplinary, in a place, and to do workshops for a whole week about storytelling, and specifically from the perspective of the land. So the team invited me to join them and to develop a workshop for Athens this year. And I prepared a workshop about site writing in relation to the work of Dimitris Pikionis, who was a Greek architect of the 20th century. Very fascinating figure and visionary architect who was somewhat misunderstood during his time. He was accused for being anti-urban, anti-modern, but his work was reappraised in later years. I invite you to have a look at his work in your own time, but maybe just to talk about the workshop. We did it in a pavilion that he built on Philopapu Hill. That was part of a renovation of a church that's also located there, the church of, I guess, Dimitrios Lombardiaris. And this was part of a wider commission he had, which is a big honor, of course, for any architect, to build the paths connecting the Acropolis and those archaeological sites with Philopapu Hill, to landscape them in a way and to allow people to access them in an easier way in the 1950s. This took place from 1954 to 1957. If you go on to the next slide, you can see these were the plans for the renovation of the church. And the pavilion where we did the workshop was up there. It's a very special place if you ever have the chance to visit it in Athens. And maybe the next slide. You can see here, so what they did at that time was you have the Acropolis and those archaeological sites here. This is Philopappou Hill, and during those 3 years they basically created these paths that allow one to explore the hill. This was also at the time, in the 1950s, where Athens was becoming more of a tourist destination. The tourism industry was growing in Greece. And very interestingly, it was also the time when the city itself, its buildings were changing from neoclassical buildings and houses that sometimes dated back to the 19th century to modern apartment blocks. So it was a time where, through a system called antiparochi, developers would take the property of families that would give it away willingly. They would take the land and the house, they would knock it down, and they would build instead a modern apartment building, sometimes without even an architect being involved. And they would give those previous owners the best 3 apartments at the top that had modern amenities, access to hot water, etc. But so at the time, Athens was full of rubble, of these building materials from these houses that were torn down. Nobody really wanted to deal with that rubble. It was different types of stone, marble, etc. And Pikionis, who was very sensitive also to these things, retrieved a lot of those pieces and used them to create the paths. So it was an early example of circular economy in architecture and a way of keeping that part of the city still alive. Then let's see how we're doing with time. This is a project which I was invited to contribute to in June. It's an exhibition that was called Gathering the Commons in Southeast London, in a place which was a very strange place, a chapel called St. Stephen's Chapel within an Orthodox enclosure within a wider cemetery called West Norwood Cemetery. And the chapel has recently been renovated to host exhibitions, cultural events, and they were organizing this show with 4 artists which looked at artisanal methods of productions, working specifically with the history of the land, and dealt with the history of the location. So I was invited to contribute a talk and to come into, maybe on the next slide you can see me here happily presenting, because I did a research project years ago that looked at that area. So the cemetery is one of the surviving green spaces of a very large forest that used to cover southeast London, which I studied. Go to the next slide. You can see here, it's a forest that used to be called the Great North Woods and used to stretch broadly, roughly from New Cross, Deptford, all the way down to Croydon. It's a very large size, and it was called the Great North Wood because of its geographical position in relation to Croydon. Of course, as the city grew, the forest was parceled and few bits remain today. I developed a research project that looked specifically at those surviving parts of this ancient forest. Places like Dulwich Woods, Sydenham Hill Woods, and Crystal Palace Park are actually surviving ancient forests that somehow were left intact, or at least were left as green spaces during the expansion of London. So I developed this research project that looked at why these parts were spared, and then how did the 19th century growth of the city lead to this partition. And of course also at how London as a global city maybe contributed to these green spaces today having species from all around the world, and the communities that use them also being very diverse. So there was this idea of a post-colonial forests emerging from these sites specifically. You can see here another map of the Great North Woods. This is John Rock's map of London from 1746. And here you have a plain, which is today Crystal Palace Park, which was called Penge Common. Common land was publicly accessible land where people could bring their animals, cattle to graze. And as London grew, of course, the city had to accommodate a growing population in the 19th century, and a lot of buildings took over this whole area. But in the mid-19th century, there was also the installation of the Crystal Palace on Penge Common, which gave the name to the Crystal Palace Park that we know today. And this, again, kind of in the same vein as the Brussels Botanical Garden, the same period also, was a moment where people's relationship to nature also changed. The Crystal Palace was first exhibited in Hyde Park in 1851 to host a great exhibition of works of industry of all nations, which was essentially the first colonial exhibition, bringing exhibits from all around the world that were presented alongside plants and animals also. And here, through this glass and steel structure in the mid-1800s, the encounter with these exhibits also brought a new way of seeing. Nature became somewhat of a phenomenological experience. And encountering these exhibits was, of course, a novelty for the local population, but it also developed their imaginary about what those places, those faraway lands were, without even having ever stepped there. It's recorded in different artworks, the interior of that place. This is a plate from the series that Matthew Digby Wyatt did about the interior of the Crystal Palace. And I looked at how the establishment of that structure there accelerated the partition of the forest, the development of the area, because again, in the same time period and in the same logic as the Botanical Garden in Brussels, it was a place, a lieu de plaisance at the edge of the city, where you would sort of go for a day, spend your Sunday, spend some money, see a concert, but in the same time contributing to changing that entire part of the city. We can talk about those a bit more later if you have any questions, but I also wanted to talk about two curatorial projects that I did in the past year. One of them being this exhibition titled A Garden, Somewhat Deserted, with the work of Neja Tomšić in Ljubljana at Ravnikar Projects. I know that some of you are going to go on a trip in a couple of weeks to Ljubljana to see the biennial. I hope you're going to have a great time. I really enjoyed that show, and I was actually very moved also by Janan's work, which SAHA supported for that biennial. So if you have the time, you can also pass by the gallery. It's in the center of the city, and they have an interesting exhibition on at the moment. But the show we did with Neja was looking at, again, the heritage of gardens, the movement of seeds and people, which is a recurring theme in her work. And the basis for this exhibition was her research connecting two green spaces, one of them being Rafut Park, which is a 19th century green space, again created in this tradition of exotic botanical collections, which was, go to the next slide. You can see here a diagram of the original plan of the park. Here was the villa of Anton Lachak, who was an architect who sort of developed also this project, and it's a very interesting place. It's close to Nova Gorica on the western part of the country, close to the Italian border, and it's full of exotic species from all over the world. It's a space that Neja Tomšić has done attentive research about, and she linked it to some gardens that, in contrast to these ones, seem to be almost silenced in histories. During the same time where this park was developed, there were Slovenian women from the area around it which immigrated from Slovenia to Alexandria in Egypt during the late 19th and early 20th century to work as wet nurses and care workers. It's a history that is little known beyond Slovenia, but these women, as they moved there and then worked to also help support their families back home, brought seeds of chicory with them, native chicory, which is native to Slovenia and to that region, and they would grow those seeds and tend to gardens in Alexandria at the cultural center for Slovenian women and in the garden for St. Francis Asylum. So Neja in the show created a temporal bridge between these two histories, between the sort of male, colonial and sort of spirit of domination of Rafut Park, which brings these exotic species from far away, and those gardens tended to by Slovenian women in Alexandria that in contrast are silenced. So she created a series of different works, including sculptures, paintings, drawings that emerged from very slow and attentive observation, uncovering those histories in both places. And finally, I'd like to maybe share some thoughts about what I might be doing here in Istanbul during the residency. This is a project that I started developing during a residency at the Cité Internationale des Arts last winter in Paris. It's called Periodical Observations, and it came from a desire to share artists' writing and invest spaces with spoken words. Because, of course, I know a lot of artists who write and for whom writing is an important part of time in the studio, but that writing rarely arrives to exhibitions in the form of a written text. It maybe becomes a video, a sound piece, but it's quite rare to find a space catered for artist writing. So this is a site-specific project. The idea is to do many editions in different places. The first one was in the laundry of the Cité Internationale des Arts, and I invited 10 artists to contribute short texts in one A4 page, which were compiled in a light publication that was made available in the laundry. They were meant for the laundry, very open theme, but everyone kept in mind the context of the site. And there was an event that launched the publication with readings and performances. And it was the beginning of what I hope will be a series of these presentations. You can see I also included an editor's note in the next slides. I've worked with a typographer called Benjamin Rousseau, who kindly allowed me to use a font that he made and helped me design the publication. And the idea is that then maybe each edition can reflect on a specific site and create a polyphonic platform for artists writing and spoken word performance, etc. So I will bring a second edition of this project here to Istanbul while I'm here. I don't have any more details to share right now of places, etc., but I'll be working on this during my time in the city. And of course, after having shared these ideas and projects, you can imagine why I've always wanted to discover Istanbul, to see the city up close and to walk its streets. It's my first time here, and of course, reading about the city from a distance, beyond the fact that it's the only city in the world that straddles two continents, and that it has the Bosphorus, of course, which is a biological corridor between two seas. I'm hugely interested in the way that it has grown and had to grow very fast over the past century. So, you're all aware of this, but on the next slide, a city that grew very fast, but that is geographically highly interesting in terms of the ecosystem that it hosts. It's also on bird migratory routes here that fly down to Africa for the winter and then back up. So It's a critical stopover site for birds who are migrating, and there's all sorts of movement of species, seeds that pass through the city. Of course, it's also a very important port city that has had international trade connections for many centuries, and this is all highly relevant to my interests, of course. Maybe on the next slide. It's also a city that grew, as I said, very fast, and over the past 100 years has grown in population size about 20 times, which is huge and exerts a very big pressure on all the systems that sustain cities. It had to grow fast to accommodate this population, but also while negotiating other crises, such as, for example, the 1999 earthquake, or adapting and mitigating climate change and its effects, and more recently, the pandemic in 2020. So while I'm here, I'll be exploring the city from its center, from its periphery, meeting the artistic community, and also doing field work. I'll be spending time notably in places like the Bostans of Istanbul, which are sites that bring together these aspects of natural and cultural heritage that I've examined in other places. And I'd be very happy to take any of your recommendations or suggestions of places and people you think I should meet or books I should read. So thank you very much for listening.